The year was 1914, a tiny island, far from the buzz of the cities and crowds of people. Only a lonely lighthouse stood there, guarding a deep secret hidden beneath the ocean waves. The film begins with a massive ship cutting through the heart of the South Atlantic Ocean. On board was a weather officer named David. The government had sent him to one of the deepest and most untouched corners of the Atlantic. David's mission was clear: stay there for 1 year to observe and collect data on the island's strange and changing weather patterns. The captain led the way, carrying David along with a year's worth of rations, medicines, and supplies. After a long, grueling journey, the tiny island finally appeared on the horizon. Emerging from the waves, it looked like a world shrouded in mystery. They reached the shore by boat and moved the gear to a small cabin near the lighthouse. David was replacing the previous officer whose term had ended. From today, David was the new guardian of this island. The old officer, Robert, was supposed to return home with Captain Axel, but when David and the captain entered the cabin, they were frozen in shock. There was no sign of life. The furniture was smashed and scattered everywhere, as if a violent struggle had taken place. Thinking the officer might be in the lighthouse, they rushed over, only to find it barricaded with sharp wooden stakes. After forcing the door open, they found a middle-aged man named Gruner on the top floor, lying there with total indifference. When asked about the old officer, Gruner replied coldly, "He's dead. Some terrible disease." When the captain asked about the body, his answer was even more chilling. Maybe someone killed him. Sensing Gruner's unstable mind, the captain offered David a chance to leave, but David desperately needed the money promised for the mission. He took the risk and decided to stay. After the ship left, David found the old officer's diary. Inside were sketches of strange, non-human creatures. Suddenly, a knock echoed at the door. As David approached with his lamp, he saw a monstrous, non-human hand reaching in from under the door. Terrified, David bolted to the basement and locked himself in. Through a tiny crack in the basement, the terrifying eyes of that mysterious creature stared at David. His body shook with fear, but he gathered his courage and grabbed a nearby knife. As the eyes appeared at the crack again, David struck with all his might. The creature shrieked in pain and vanished into the darkness. The next morning, as sunlight spread, David cautiously stepped outside. He saw strange marks on the sand, footprints but not human. They emerged from the ocean waves, led straight to his house, and disappeared back into the water. David finally understood why Gruner had barricaded the lighthouse. This house was no longer safe. Terrified, David ran desperately toward the lighthouse. He hammered on the door, shouting, "Open up! Let me in!" But Gruner peered through the window and said coldly, "You should have left with that ship." He flatly refused to help. Heartbroken, David returned home, knowing the creatures would return tonight. David didn't give up. He reinforced every window with heavy wood and built a perimeter of sharp stakes around the house. Remembering that animals fear fire, he piled old papers and books by the gate and soaked them in oil. He hoped the flames would keep him safe through the night. Then luck favored him. Inside the house, he found an old chest containing a rifle and plenty of ammunition. Seeing the bullets gave him a surge of hope. As the sun set and a deep red glow filled the sky, darkness began to swallow the island. David sat in a corner, clutching his gun, his heartbeat so loud he could hear it. A strange sound pierced the silence. When David peeked through a crack in the window, his heart sank. Emerging from the calm waves were dozens of those bizarre creatures. Their eyes glowed in the dark as they marched toward his home. Within moments, they began clawing at the doors and windows. David immediately opened fire. The sound of the rifle echoed across the island. Some creatures fell, but the rest became even more violent, climbing the walls to get inside. Seeing their numbers grow, David wasted no time and torched the oil-soaked papers. Flames leaped toward the sky, and terrified, the creatures fled back into the sea. But as one danger passed, another arrived. David's wooden house caught fire instantly. The entire place was soon engulfed in flames. Wrapping himself in a wet sheet, David smashed through the gate and ran. He hid behind a large rock near the lighthouse, his right hand badly burned and throbbing with pain. Luckily, a heavy rain began to fall, dousing the fire. By morning, the house was nothing but ashes. With no shelter and no food, David knew the lighthouse was his only hope. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks, waiting for Gruner to step out. As Gruner stepped out to fetch water, David held him at gunpoint, but Gruner instantly drew his own weapon. Suddenly, a strange creature sitting near Gruner lunged at David. It was Gruner's protector. Gruner stopped it, saying, "He's my pet." David then made his offer. "If we both want to survive, let me in. I have gunpowder and a year's worth of food." Gruner remained silent for a moment, seeing the determination in David's eyes. Finally, he nodded and let him in. Before sunset, they shifted the remaining food and gunpowder water into the safety of the lighthouse. The next morning, David woke up to a miracle. The female creature was silently licking his burnt hand. Startled, David pulled back, only to realize the wound had almost healed. At the top of the lighthouse, David saw Gruner carefully counting the bullets. The creature was helping him in her own strange way. David was shocked. The being he thought was a monster was actually intelligent and calm, but Gruner had no interest in fame or the outside world. He had carved Gruner as king into the rocks, choosing to be a master in this wasteland rather than a slave in society. David eventually learned how the creature became Gruner's pet. Years ago, she had been caught in his fishing net as a cub. Gruner saved her, but he was a cruel master. He didn't treat her with humanity. He treated her as a slave, even forcing a physical relationship that shook David to his core. Gruner revealed that after she once tried to attack him, he punished her so brutally that she now lived in total submission. David finally understood the nightly attacks. The other creatures were coming from the sea to rescue their companion. They couldn't stand sunlight, so they used the cover of darkness to lay siege to the lighthouse. Suffocated by the island, David looked for any passing ship to signal for help, but Gruner warned him, no ships pass this way. As dusk fell, Gruner handed David a gun and growled, "Get ready, they're coming." As the massive lighthouse beam cut through the dark, hundreds of creatures emerged from the black water. Gruner fired like a madman, but David, paralyzed by fear, retreated into a corner and collapsed into unconsciousness. The next morning, Gruner kicked him awake with an ultimatum. If you want to stay, you work. David was forced into a life of misery, hauling water, cleaning the lighthouse, and standing the terrifying night watch. David endured Gruner's tyranny and the torture of the female creature. One night, to teach him a lesson, Gruner locked David outside. He spent the entire night fighting for his life against the monsters. By dawn, David was covered in blood, but his fear was dead. He finally knew how to fight back. Over time, David formed a bond with the creature, whom he named Anaris. He realized the pain of being separated from one's own kind. One night, while they were distracted by a game of chess, they forgot to turn on the lighthouse light. Sensing the darkness, the creatures launched their most violent assault yet, swarming the stairs. As their ammunition ran dry and Gruner suffered a deep leg injury, death seemed certain. But the first rays of morning saved them. David knew they couldn't win this war of attrition. He then spotted a wrecked boat from an old smuggling ship stuck in a corner of the island. Gruner explained the boat belonged to a ship that sank during a storm. A dangerous plan formed in David's mind. Extract the dynamite from that wreckage and wipe out these monsters once and for all. David was now obsessed with one thing, getting the dynamite. Gruner initially refused, fearing the dark depths where the creatures lived, but David knew that without ammo, they wouldn't survive another night. Gruner eventually agreed, but with a dark motive. He planned to let David retrieve the explosives and then abandon him to the monsters, keeping Anaris as his slave forever. Wearing a heavy iron diving suit, David descended into the ocean. The underwater world was a graveyard of shipwrecks and bones. He found the dynamite boxes, but suddenly the creatures appeared. Panicked, David tripped in his heavy suit, unable to move. He braced for death, only to see they weren't hunters. They were curious children staring at him in wonder. David barely made it back to the surface, shocking Gruner, who thought he was dead. They rigged the dynamite in 2 defensive layers around the lighthouse. Months passed. Snow began to fall, and strangely, the attacks stopped. Losing his mind, Gruner suspected Anaris had warned her kind about their explosive trap. In a fit of rage, Gruner began brutally beating Anaris until David intervened. Finally, they played a desperate card, leaving the main door wide open as bait. At nightfall, a tide of creatures surged toward the lighthouse, but when Gruner pulled the lever, nothing happened. David had forgotten to connect the wires. Chaos erupted. Creatures began scaling the walls. David raced to the top to fix the wires while Gruner held the line with his rifle. The moment the connection clicked, David triggered the first blast. A massive explosion rocked the island, tearing through the monsters. But the survivors grew more feral, forcing Gruner to detonate the second layer. The shockwave knocked both men unconscious. The next morning, David woke to a field of corpses. Anaris was gone. Gruner was cold-bloodedly executing the wounded survivors. Then David noticed something on a dead creature's neck, a pearl necklace. His heart sank. These weren't just animals. They were a civilized species with culture and emotions. They were only attacking to rescue their own. David realized their catastrophic mistake. They had destroyed an entire civilization because of a misunderstanding and Gruner's madness. In a final act of peace, David built a small stone circle and placed a toy whalebone boat he had made for Anaris inside. He hoped she would return, but only the silence of the waves answered him. One morning, David found Gruner unconscious near his old belongings. He saw a photograph that froze his blood. It was the same woman from the diary. She was Gruner's wife. Gruner's real name was Robert. He was the officer from a year ago. Loneliness and grief had driven him mad, and he had changed his identity to never leave this island. David felt like a prisoner of the island. That evening, he saw the toy boat was gone from the stone circle. In its place stood a small creature holding the toy. David threw down his torch, signaling he no longer wanted to fight. Anaris and her her kin emerged from the shadows. Their eyes held no hate, only a painful silence. They wanted peace. When Gruner tried to attack again, David called him by his real name. Robert, the king, crumbled. Realizing his cruelty, Robert surrendered himself to the creatures, who finally killed him. A year later, when the rescue ship arrived, they mistook David for Gruner. David boarded the ship in silence, his heart still on that island. Anaris was free with her children, and David buried that haunting truth forever. Please subscribe the channel.